Hello everyone, welcome back again to my YouTube channel. Today we will see how we can set up a single sign-on in Salesforce. In order to conclude for this single sign-on, we would be using two Salesforce orgs. One Salesforce org we will consider this as the identity provider, and another Salesforce org we will consider as service provider. So if we really talk about this single sign-on, then single sign-on is an authentication method that enables users to access multiple applications with one login and one set of the credentials. Let's continue setting up our one Salesforce org for the identity provider and another Salesforce org as the single sign-on or service provider. So here I am logged into my two Salesforce instances. One is Inevitable Yogendra, which will be considered as the identity provider, and another one is Einstein Yogi, which will be considered as the service provider. Let's go on to set up the identity provider first. To enable for the identity provider, firstly we need to create a certificate. So just type in this certificate and you will see a certificate and key management. In this section, you need to create a self-signed certificate that we will be using to enable or to allow for the identity provider. Let's name it as identity provider SSO certificate and click on save. Now what you need to do is you go back to the identity provider. Just type in the identity in the quick find box and you will see identity provider as an option. Click on the identity provider and enable the identity provider. Here you will see a couple of options. Either you can choose the recently created certificate, or you can go on to create a new certificate, which will again take you to the same page where how we did create the certificate previously. So moving back again to the identity provider and enabling the identity provider will allow you to save the identity provider with the recently created identity provider SSO certificate. On this, you will have to do a couple of actions. One is download the certificate, which is the certificate that you did create. And another one is to download the metadata. So you need to download the metadata, you need to download the certificate. We would be using them once we are setting it up in the service provider for the single sign-on. Now let's come back to the service provider application. And here again, you go for the certificate and key management. This certificate and key management will be responsible to sign your identity provider certificates. So let's give it as service provider SSO certificate and save it. Once you save the certificate for the service provider, then you again go back to the identity section, and under that identity section, you will see a single sign-on setting. We need to enable the single sign-on for the service provider. Just click on SAML enable and click on save. Once you enable the single sign-on, then you can go on to create your SAML single sign-on settings. There are a couple of options. Either you can choose the new and then you can start afresh. You can provide your name, API name, entity ID, issuer, the certificates and others. Or else if you have the metadata available with you, then you can choose the another option, that is to create a new single sign-on setting from the custom metadata or the metadata that you have downloaded from the identity provider or you have been given from the identity provider. Just choose the file wherever you have saved this and click on create. This will create your identity, this will create a single sign-on setting. You can give any meaningful name. Let's say I'm giving it as login using single sign-on, and the API name would then be auto-populated. You have the issuer. So if you consider this issuer, and if you go back again to your identity provider, then you will see the issuer is linked to here. This issuer, along with the other details of the certificates, would be available here to use in the SAML single sign-on settings on the service provider application. If you really talk about the issuer is basically the one who provides you the identity for your service provider. And entity ID is something which will work as the service provider. So the URL here in the entity ID is the domain URL for your service provider. Then under the identity provider certificate, you need to choose the certificate that you use to create your identity provider. So just to enable your identity provider certificate under the single sign-on setting, upload that certificate that you downloaded from the identity provider. Then another option is to request signing your certificate. So when you sign your certificate, it requires your service provider to have the certificate. So that's where we did create this service provider SSO certificate to sign the identity provider. Then on this request signature method, we would be using RSA SHA 256 algo to signature the method. Then in case if you are using the assertion encryption technique at the identity provider side, then you can go ahead with the assertion decryption certificate as well, and you can choose the available option of the certificate that you have created in your service provider, and the same certificate you can download and upload it in the identity provider side connected app, so that the assertion would then be encrypted and decrypted with the correct certificate. Then you have the SAML identity type. Here you have a couple of options how you want to go ahead with your single sign-on setting. Whether you want to go ahead with the username, or you want to go ahead with the federation ID, or you want to go ahead with the user ID from the user object. For now, I'll go ahead with the federation ID from the user object. And under the SAML identity location, there are again a couple of options. How would you define this identity type? So let's say when I say federation ID, so where will you get this federation ID? Would that be available in any custom element, or maybe the attribute element, or would that be available in the name identifier element of the subject statement? Let's keep it to the default, as identity is in the name identifier element of the subject statement. Then service provider initiated request binding. You have the option of choosing between HTTP post and HTTP redirect. I'll go and choose HTTP post. Then you have this single sign-on enabled, and then you can leave the rest as default. At the bottom, you will see just-in-time user provisioning. So this just-in-time user provisioning is responsible whenever you set up your single sign-on. And let's say the user is logging into your service provider for the first time. And if the user is not available in the service provider, then it allows you to create the user on the fly if the user is trying to log into the service provider using single sign-on for the first time. But since we are not going ahead for this, and for more details about this just-in-time user provisioning, you can check my another video that I have made for how you can use the just-in-time for user provisioning. You can get the links on the I section at the top. For now, just leave it to blank and click on save. Once you save this single sign-on setting, you will see a couple of the important fields and the information there. For example, the issuer is there, which is the identity provider, then entity ID, which is a domain URL or the URL for your single sign-on, and then you will have the login URL, the logout URL. In case if you have enabled this single logout, then you can use this logout URL at your identity provider side, and this will enable your single sign-on setting for your service provider. Now going back again to the identity provider. So as we know, we have created the identity provider. We have also enabled the single sign-on setting. Now, in order to have the handshake between the identity provider and the service provider, we need to create a connected app. So go on to create a connected app. Let's give it as service provider org. Give a contact email, and then you can choose the logo image URL and the icon URL. Either you can have your own, or you can go on to choose from the available Salesforce library. I'm choosing again with the available Salesforce library, the logo URL and the icon URL, and just provide them. And before this, you go back again to your service provider and go on to the certificate and key management. There you created this certificate service provider SSO certificate. Just download this certificate as well, because if you remember on the single sign-on setting, we have requested for signing the certificate using this service provider SSO certificate. So this certificate we would be using in the connected app when we are verifying the signature. Again, come back to the identity provider where you are creating your connected app. And since we have already given a couple of information with the logo image URL and the icon URL, now a little bit down, if you scroll, then you will have a couple of options, API or web app settings, because this time we are going to use the SAML, and hence you choose an option enable SAML under the web app setting. And then you see here the entity ID. So this entity ID, you can get it from the service provider single sign-on setting. Go back to the service provider and the single sign-on setting, and you will see the entity ID. Copy this entity ID and paste it against the entity ID. Same, you can paste it for the start URL. Then the ACS URL is nothing but the assertion consumer service, which is the login URL that you get it at the bottom under the endpoints of your single sign-on setting on the service provider application. Then you just copy this login URL from the service provider single sign-on setting and paste it against the ACS URL. Enable this single logout to have the one logout experience. Then you can go on to copy paste this logout URL again from the single sign-on setting from your service provider and paste it against the single sign-on URL, single logout URL. Then you can provide the type of binding for this single logout, whether you want to go ahead for HTTP redirect or HTTP post. Let's select the HTTP post. And if you come back to the subject type, then if you remember on the service provider single sign-on setting, when we were setting this up, we know that we had a couple of options, whether we want to choose the username as the SAML identity type, or the federation ID, or the user ID, and we selected the federation ID for the assertions from the user object. Then you go on to choose the subject type as federation ID, or else you have those other options, username, user ID, or custom attribute. This custom attribute is responsible when you set the identity location as the attribute element. Since we have chosen the default name identifier, we will keep it as federation ID. And then the name ID format would remain the default one, which is unspecified. The issuer is the identity provider domain URL, which is the identity provider domain here at the top. Then you have the IDP certificate. This IDP certificate is the identity provider certificate. So if you remember, when we were creating this identity provider, we enabled that identity provider using this certificate, identity provider SSO certificate. So choose this certificate, and then we are to verify the signature, because when we did set up the single sign-on setting on the service provider, we specifically asked to request for the signing of the certificate using the service provider certificate. And as we have also downloaded, so we will verify the certificate signatures. We'll upload the certificate from the service provider, so that it would be kind of two-way verification. One is at the identity provider side and another way to the service provider side. And then the signing algo, as we have enabled the SHA 256 algo here at the service provider side for signature method, then we'll choose the signing algorithm for the SAML messages as SHA 256. And then rest of the other fields, you can leave it to default or blank and save the record or save the connected app. Once you save the connected app, you are allowed to use the connected app. But in order to use the connected app, you must have the permission. So to enable the permission for your users to use this connected app, go back to the manage connected app, and under that you will see the profiles section, who you want to give the permission to run this connected app. For the demo purpose, I am going to give this permission to the system administrator and click on save. So your system administrators would now be having the access to use this connected app. And in this connected app, you will see one IDP initiated login URL. So when we talk about this single sign-on, there are basically two ways to enable this single sign-on. One is the IDP initiated or identity provider initiated, and next is the service provider initiated. When your service applications or the service provider is enabled from the identity provider, it is called as identity provider initiated single sign-on. And if you enable your service provider applications from the service provider itself, then it will be called as service provider initiated single sign-on. So since I am into my identity provider now, and if you click on this IDP initiated login URL, you should be able to log into your service provider application. But since if you see here, it is giving me an error, insufficient privilege. That's okay. Why we are getting this error? Because if you remember, we have set our single sign-on to continue using the federation ID on the user object. Yeah. And if you really see the user, I did not set up my user to have any federation ID. So if I go back to my user account in both the orgs, let me go to my user account in service provider. And in this service provider, if you see the federation ID, which is blank, same is true when I see my user account on the identity provider and the federation ID is blank. Let me give the federation ID and click on save. And same federation ID, because right now we are assuming that the users exist in both the orgs. So if the user is existing on both the orgs, they must have the same federation ID, and using that federation ID, the single sign-on will match against the available user in the identity provider and use that information to log into the service provider, where the user would be having the same federation ID that you have in your identity provider. Now, as we have enabled the users to have the federation ID, we have set the federation ID on both the user accounts in service provider and onto the identity provider. Now, if I again go back to my app manager, let me go back to the app manager and open the connected app that I have created just now and go on to manage. We have already given the profile permission, and now if you click on this IDP initiated login URL, you must be able to log in. If you see the URL is changing from the identity provider URL, that is Inevitable Yogendra, it is being changed to Einstein Yogi. And why I am able to successfully log in now? Because the federation ID is doing the trick here. The federation ID on the identity provider is same as the federation ID on the service provider, and hence I'm able to log in. But from the identity provider, this is not a great practice that everybody would be having this access to view this connected app, and they can go on to the manage section and they can click on the IDP initiated login URL. So for this purpose, since we have created this connected app, and this can be rendered in the Salesforce or as a standalone application as well. So if you go back to your app launcher, and you must be able to see the service provider or for your app launcher applications. Let's say I go to my service console application first. And if I click on the app launcher and the recently created connected app, which is service provider org, and if you click on this way it will give the better user experience for the end users, and you are redirected to the service provider applications from the identity provider. And because you are at the identity provider side here, and on this identity provider you are going to choose the connected app from the app launcher, and that's where your identification is starting for the single sign-on. That's why it is called the identity provider initiated single sign-on. Now, if I talk about the service provider initiated single sign-on, what you need to do is go back to your service provider and go to My Domains. Under the My Domains, you will see a section called Authentication Configuration. Click on this edit button against this authentication configuration and choose login using single sign-on from the available authentication service and save this. What will happen when you do this is, along with the out of the box login forms where you can use the user ID and the password, you can also have another option to log into your org using the single sign-on. And this single sign-on relies on the identity provider. And since we are now on the service provider, and from there you will first be taken to the identity provider, and from there your identity would be verified and you are redirected back to your service provider. That's why it is called the service provider initiated single sign-on. Now, if I log out from this org, the service provider org, this will also log me out from my identity provider as well, because if you remember, I have enabled the single logout. And if I refresh this, I must not be able to log in here. That's fine, absolutely perfect. Now, if I go back here, so I must be able to see the options now. One is to use the username and the password, or else if I don't want to go ahead using the username and the password, I can choose the another login option. Right now I'm onto the identity provider. Let me go to the service provider. Okay. So this Einstein Yogi instance is for my service provider Salesforce instance. Here you can see I have the options either to log in using the username and the password, or I can log in using the single sign-on that I have just enabled. So when I try to go for the inevitable Yogendra, which is my identity provider, and if you will see, I'm not logged into this. Yeah. And if I will try to log in using the single sign-on, you see the URL, it will change to my identity provider first. And from there on, I will be logged into the identity provider. And the Salesforce then consider this identity coming in from the identity provider as the valid identity, and it allows me to log into the service provider. So this process is called the service provider initiated single sign-on. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you have enjoyed about the single sign-on settings and how you can enable the single sign-on in the Salesforce. Thank you very much. If you like my video, please like and subscribe. Thank you.